Hey guys, it's Jez. Welcome back to another reading wrap-up video. So today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts and opinions on all of the books that I read from the months of July to September. So grab a snack. This is probably going to be a pretty long video because I read so many books. All the audiobooks that I'll be mentioning in this video, I will have them linked in the description. So if you guys would like to listen to the versions that I listen to, they will be down below. But if you don't have that much time to listen to something like Jurassic Park, which is I think like 14 hours long, I will have abridged versions as well in the description. So let's get started with the month of July. So for the month of July, I read 2 books. The first book that I finished was Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. I rated this book 5 stars because I really enjoyed it. It was very informational. There were so many things that I learned from reading this book, even though that this is a pretty, I guess, outdated book now since this was published back in 2009. So the numbers and the statistics are outdated now. And as I mentioned in a previous video, I don't remember which one it was, but I mentioned how there is a section in the book where he just has a sort of glossary. He just has a list of all of these words with the corresponding definitions of them. And you can see how, I don't know what the right word is. I don't know if it's skewed or biased. You can see just how things are just really not in our favor. There's a lot of politics involved in agriculture. I don't know how to explain it, but business is still business. Things just get swept under the rug a lot of the times from what I read in this book. And there's also just a lot of loopholes that a lot of these companies and businesses go through. It's upsetting and makes you angry because business is still business. People's health and well-being are not really considered, unfortunately. So anyway, that's all I've got to say, I think, because I can't really articulate what I'm trying to make sense in my head. But yeah, I still highly recommend this book. I learned a lot from it, even though that this is an older book and that the statistics are not very accurate in this time. But I still think that the things discussed in this book are still pretty relevant in this day and age. So yeah, the next book that I read in July is Alice in Wonderland. If this isn't my third, it's my 4th reread of this book. I rated this book 3.75 stars. It's an okay book. It's not the most enjoyable read for me personally, but I still enjoyed it nonetheless. I still find it very enjoyable because of how wacky and ridiculous things are. It's still very entertaining to read. The only thing that I don't really like is Alice. I just don't really like the main character. She acts like a child because she is one. I find some of the things that she does a bit annoying, but it makes sense. She's a kid. She's acting like a kid. I don't really like her that much, but still, it's a fun read. Okay, moving on to August. So this is the month where I read the most amount of books that I've ever read in my entire life, I think. In August, I read 9 books, and this is also the start of my audiobook phase, era, whatever you want to call it. In August, the first book that I read was Jurassic Park. I know I've mentioned this book quite a bit in my previous videos, but it's so good. This is again one of my favorite books that I've read this year, and I really loved it. It was so good. I rated this book 5 stars, as I said, just because it's such a fun, enjoyable, entertaining book. It's action-packed, there's drama. It's just amazing. It's a fun book to read, and I like a lot of action stuff. I find that very entertaining. I like action movies and action in books because it's just very entertaining for me. 5 stars, loved it, enjoyed it, highly recommend. The next book that I read is A Wrinkle in Time. This is my 2nd reread of this book, I think, or 3rd reread. But this is my first time listening to an audiobook of A Wrinkle in Time. And A Wrinkle in Time is actually one of my favorite books as a kid. I would actually say it was my favorite book as a kid. It was always in my number 1 spot. I rated this specific audiobook 4.75 stars. It was very interesting actually listening to this audiobook because how the narrator portrayed certain characters was very different from how I portray them when I read the actual physical book. There were some things that I noticed in this audiobook that I didn't when I read the physical book myself. For example, Meg. In the audiobook, she is a lot more emotional than how I remembered her when I read this book. Yeah, she was a lot more emotional. She was a lot more easily angered in this audiobook, which is something that I did not pick up on when I read this myself. So that was very interesting. I guess the characterization of Meg in this audiobook was just so different in my head, and also actually with some of the other characters as well, like with Charles Wallace. The portrayal of Charles Wallace in the audiobook was actually a lot closer to how I portrayed him. He's definitely much more like calm, cool, collected in my memory of how I remember reading him. I don't want to spoil anything though, because there is this one scene later on in the book when they're... Can't spoil anything. How can I explain this without spoiling stuff? But basically, I guess there was this one scene where it's like a very emotionally heightened scene, and how the other characters were portrayed were very different from how I remembered reading them. Meg, surprisingly, was the only one that stayed the same from how I remembered reading this scene when I was a kid. And I was just so confused why the other characters were acting differently from how I remembered. This was just a very interesting reading experience because of how things were just different from how I remembered them. And this is probably going to be a theme that you'll see throughout the other audiobooks that I've listened to, where I have actually read the physical books first, but we'll get into that later on. So yeah, that was A Wrinkle in Time. Again, the audiobook version is 4.75 stars. That's how I rated it. But the physical book is still a 5-star book for me. I think I just need to reread it again and see if my feelings and thoughts will change. And then the next books that I read in August, this is a series. I read the Spiderwick Chronicles, which has 5 books. And they were very short. I did not think that they would be this short, but each audiobook is just around an hour long. And for the entire series, I rated it 4.25 stars. So each book is 4.25. So yeah, it was good. It was very different from the movie. So I actually watched the movie first before I read the books. While the movie adaptation is very different, I still think it's good. I think it's still a fun movie to watch, despite it being pretty different, because the movie adaptation is actually comprised of all of the books in the series, except for, I would say, book 4, The Ironwood Tree, because I don't remember a lot of the scenes from that book specifically be in the movie. I wouldn't say that the books are necessarily better than the movie, but to each their own, I guess. I personally think that they're both good in their own right, but with the books, the only thing that I didn't like is how short they are. I just wish that they were longer so that we could get to see more of the world. Not really the world, because it's set in our world, but there's like a magical, like, other world within our world that I wish we got to explore more, like the fairy world, sprites world, that kind of thing, you know? But yeah, I just wish that the books were longer. That's my only qualms with the series. But other than that, still very good, very fun. And then the next book that I read in August is From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. And this is my first reread of this book, because I did read the physical book when I was in middle school or in high school? I don't remember anymore. I only read it once before listening to this audiobook. I rated this audiobook 3.75 stars. I think I would actually rate the physical book the same rating, because it's not the most, I guess, action-packed book. It's not the most adventurous book, because it is set in, you know, the real world. It's realistic fiction. There's not really any sort of fantasy elements in it. That's why it's probably not as fun and entertaining for me, because it's like lacking those kind of elements in it. Because this is a reread, how the characters were portrayed were different from how I remembered reading them. So there's like this weird sort of like disconnect happening while I was reading. It was still very interesting to read, because there were still like a lot of interesting things, because I think this book was written or published in like the 1960s, so there's like a lot of interesting things that you can compare to with the world back then with how it is today. There was this one scene, I think, where I think they were talking about like how much things cost, how things were priced back then compared to now. So yeah, this book was still good, had some interesting bits in it. It's just not the most exciting. And then the last book that I read in August is The Lost World, which is the sequel to Jurassic Park. I actually initially rated this lower but I decided to just rate it 5 stars because I did enjoy the book, but it just took me a little bit longer to get into. Actually, this actually happened with Jurassic Park as well. Like, it took me a while to really get into the book because I was comparing it to the movies in my head, and how the intros were in the movies were very different from how the intros were in the books, so it took me a while. Overall, very good book, very, very entertaining. So with this book, despite it having different characters from the previous book, the only characters that were the same or that were in the previous book were Jeff Goldblum's character, Ian Malcolm, as well as a character that was briefly mentioned and was briefly shown in the movie as well. His name is Dodgson. So he was the guy that was talking to Nedry. So he's actually in this book, and I am so happy that he's a main character in this book because he was just briefly mentioned in Jurassic Park, and you just think that his character is just like this greedy capitalist guy, but because he's more of like a main character in this one, we get to learn more about him and his personality, which is he's insane. He's crazy. And I just love that we get to see it in this book because he is not just this greedy capitalist guy. He's actually a lot more sinister, which I loved seeing in this book. I think he is also just very important because he is the main antagonist in this book. I don't think that there would be much conflict without him. So he's very, very important in this book, and I love that. I love that they brought him back in the sequel. Okay, moving on to September, I only read 4 books, and the first one that I read was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I think this is my second reread of this book. I first read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in high school, actually, for my English class, because I was comparing it to like Greek dramas or Greek tragedies, something like that. I was comparing how like the structures of it were similar. I remember just comparing like the choruses in Greek dramas or tragedies as like the Oompa Loompas in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Anyway, so that was my first time reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I'd only watched the movie before that, the Tim Burton one, not the older one. I love this book. I rated this 4 stars. I loved Roald Dahl growing up. He was one of my favorite authors as a kid. I liked reading this book. Very fun, very entertaining, very wacky, ridiculous, kind of like with all of the Roald Dahl books. So yeah, it was just very good. Had fun reading this one. And as I also mentioned in my reading vlog, my previous video, I didn't think that Roald Dahl would be making some sort of commentary against TV, which was very interesting because when I read Matilda, which is the next book that I read, he does the same thing. He makes commentary against TV and how it rots children's brains or how it makes children lose their creativity. That's why he encourages kids to read. And that's why in Matilda, she's like this good example of what like a good kid is, because comparing it to her brother who's living in the same house as her, but he's the one that's watching TV all the time. He's portrayed as this very dumb kid who isn't very smart. Whereas her, because she reads books, she's this smart girl, very intellectual as a very, very young kid and very articulate as well. You can't help but notice the comparison between the two kids. So yeah, I just thought that was very interesting because I didn't think that he would be making any sort of commentary against TV. With Matilda, I loved this book. This was one of my favorite books growing up. It was just very fun, again, to read this book. But again, as I mentioned with the other books where I had already read the physical books first, how these narrators portray these characters were just very different from how I remember reading them. The next book that I read is The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. This is the first book of the series of Unfortunate Events series. I've been wanting to read this series for a long time because I really loved the movie. I would really love to buy the series because I would love to read the entire thing. It was just very good. I really liked it. I rated this book 4.5 stars. I loved it. There's no fantasy elements in this book, but it still feels very like whimsical in a way. And I love that. So yeah, if there's any books like this that you know of, please comment them down below. I'd love to read them. And then the last book that I read in September is The Tale of Despero by Kate DiCamillo. This is my first reread of this book. I again read this book when I was in elementary school in the 5th grade. Maybe this is just for the audiobook version, but I rated it 3.75 stars. As I keep on mentioning, how the narrators portrayed certain characters were just different from how I remember them. And also with this particular version of the audiobook, I found that I didn't really enjoy it this time around. When I first read this book, I was just very interested in Despero and his quest, his adventure, and I didn't really care for the other characters that were pretty much in his way. But this time around, I found myself not really liking him that much. I didn't find myself caring for him. In this reread, I actually cared more about Roscuro and this other character called Miguri So. So when I first read this book, didn't really care about Miguri. I just didn't like her. She was in the way of Despero's quest, adventure of saving the princess, whatever. I actually liked Roscuro when I first read this book, and I still like him in this reread. I actually found myself empathizing with him more because I guess I just didn't understand in my first read of this book what was going on with him. I still really like Roscuro's character. And with Miguri So, as I mentioned, did not care for her at all my first read of this book. But with this one, I found myself empathizing with her. She's just such a... It's so sad. Her life is so sad. And I did not get this during my first read because I did not know what this meant. So she's described as this girl that has cauliflower ears. Now I know what those are. She has these ears because she keeps getting beat by, one, her dad, two, there's these other characters who work in the castle that also keep on hitting her ears for some reason. And because she has these ears, she is very hard of hearing. She always has to keep on asking what the other people are talking about or what the people are asking of her because she can't really hear well because of these ears. And also, she's not very smart. So she gets taken advantage of in a way because of how dumb she is. So that's why her character is this very unfortunate character, and I empathize with her a lot more during this reread because I just did not pick up on any of these things during my first read as a kid. I still don't like her, but I empathize with her character more. And going back to Despero, I didn't really care for him that much in this reread, which is very interesting because he was the only one that I cared about during my first read of this book. And I just found that I didn't really like him. I mean, he's still a kid, technically, so it's just some of the things that he does that rubs me the wrong way. He's kind of delusional, and I don't know if it's in a good way or not, but it's still weird. I don't know how to feel about him anymore. I guess I'll just have to read the physical book again to see if my thoughts and feelings will change. So yeah, that is all of the books that I read from July to September. I read so many books this quarter, which I'm very, very happy about. Very proud of myself. I achieved my second reading goal for this year, which is amazing. I did make myself another reading goal. I set my third reading goal to read 30 books by the end of this year. I don't know if I'll be able to do it. We'll see. We'll see by the end of the year if I'll achieve that third reading goal. But yeah, that is it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!